Okay. Okay. All right. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Karamayam Darati Swaparantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Uttaparakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavam Sa Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Paran Sahagana Lalita Sri Visakanvitam Scha Namo Bhakti Vinodaya Satchidananda Namine Gaura Sakti Sarupaya Rupanugavarayate Vande Sri Krishna Chaitanya Nityanando Sahorito Gauraraye Pushpavanto Chitro Sando Tamonuro Vande Ham Sri Ramakrishna Bhaya Charana Sako Sukaro Paramanando Sundaro Subalapriyo Shri Guru Shri Gaudiya Vaishnava Guru Parampara Ki Jai Shri Param Kurun Ki Jai Shri Guru Dev Ki Jai. Okay, welcome everybody. Omkar, nice to have you here. Rama Mohan, and I already said hi to Marosh, Carolina, and Krishna Kumari. So last week we left off where so Devidas had gone to meet his father's guru, and he was very impressed by him, right? You know, they talked about Vedanta and what's the best commentary and things like this. And then Devidas, the son of Lahiri Mahashaya, asked if he could become, like basically start studying Vedanta under Vaishnavdas Babaji. But Vaishnavdas Babaji said, well, you know, my life and soul is just to serve the Vaishnavas and chant Harinam, so I don't have time for any Vedanta. And so, but maybe you should check out the commentary of Mahaprabhu that was written down by different devotees on the Vedanta Sutra. And so after that, Devidas came back to the kutir of Lahiri Mahashaya and like told the whole story of what had happened. And Lahiri was, of course, very happy about it. But then Devidas again kind of came out with why he had come there in the first place, which was to take his dad back home to Shantipur. And so that's where we're at right now. And we'll just continue from there. And so then Devidas says, well, you know, actually the real reason, although I'm learning all this stuff about the Vaishnava Dharma and Vedanta and stuff, the real reason I came nonetheless is that I wanted to take you back home, and the whole family wants you to return. And then Lahiri says that he's taken a pledge to never enter a home that's opposed to bhakti. So if you want to have me come back home, then first all you have to become Vaishnavas. And Devidas is kind of blown away by this, because he says, well, what are you talking about? Like, we worship the deity every day in our home, and we host Vaishnavas, and we don't disrespect Harinam. So like, what's the question of us not being Vaishnavas already? Excuse me. And this thing brings an interesting thought to my mind. The fact that previously, like we talked about it last time, Lahiri Mahashaya said that that he used to call his son an atheist, but now he doesn't criticize anybody because he understands how adhikar works, and he understands that everybody's working according to their adhikar, which in the last class I kind of equated somewhat with that Brené Brown idea of everybody's, in general, everybody's doing the best they can with whatever they have to work with. But one thing that I forgot to mention, or maybe it just didn't come to my mind at that point, is that although Lahiri Mahashaya is saying that he doesn't criticize anybody, and he sees that people have different adhikars, that doesn't mean, nonetheless, it doesn't mean that we don't discriminate. And let me explain what I mean with that, or like make judgments in a way, or judgment calls. Because although Lahiri Mahashaya said he doesn't criticize anybody, he's still saying that I'm not going to come with you because I don't want to associate with you. Like if somebody told you, I don't criticize you, but I don't want to spend any time with you, that you could take that as a form of criticism, right? And I think it's kind of a subtle point. I think it has to be thought about a little more to, I think, understand what the principle is behind it. Because in the West, I think it's very easy to think that not criticizing anybody means that you think that everybody is on equal footing in every way. I mean, there's this very strong push for equality and kind of like leveling the playing field in the West. And, it has a lot of good sides to it as well, taking down this, or breaking down this like artificial hierarchy based on just like position instead of natural qualities. But there is some kind of a hierarchy based on people's natural qualities that is, you could say, like more like a natural hierarchy in terms of especially who you want to associate with. And it doesn't mean, like, Lahiri Mahashaya doesn't criticize anybody because he recognizes that there are different levels, basically, and people act according to the level they're at. But at the same time, he is making that judgment call that he doesn't want to associate with people who affect his bhakti in a negative way. And if you misunderstand that principle, then you could think of it as a criticism of like saying, you're lower than me. I have higher adhikar. I'm so elevated, so I'm not going to, waste my time in your bad company or something like that. But of course, that's not at all Lahiri Mahashaya's attitude. It's more like, I'm a servant of the Vaishnavas. I'm a servant of Bhakti Devi. And to do my service in the best possible way, I need to keep good company, that my consciousness stays clean and all stays like elevated in the way of being connected with bhakti instead of maya or the karmic realm. So I think that's the way of really looking at it. It's good to remember that this kind of non-criticism is not this kind of like sentimental, completely just like undiscriminating, unconditional love in every way. Although that does happen, then later on, when you become a Uttamadhikari, it's said that at that point, then you actually break through this need to discriminate, because then there's no question of you having any other influence in your life than bhakti. You can't stop the flow of bhakti anymore. You're completely in the flow, as they say. And so at that point, who cares about discriminating about anything? You're just like constantly in this ragatmika stage of experiencing bhakti firsthand, and there's nothing can stop it at that point anymore. Anyway, kind of a long segue here, so let's get back to the story. So Lahiri Mahashaya says, well, yeah, just become devotees and I'll be happy to come back home. And then, the son is like, what are you talking about? We are Vaishnavas. And then Lahiri says, like Vaishnavas, and you do all the right things and you say all the right things, but David asks, well, how do we become real Vaishnavas? And then unstable internet. Oh shoot, hold on just a second. Oh, I hope. Yeah, Omkar is moving on the video. Good. Sorry about that. I have some two different networks here, so they keep jumping sometimes. Anyway, so then the son asks, well, what do we have to do to become real Vaishnavas, And Lahiri says, well, you got to like leave all of your Naimitika duties, the kind of like, what's the translation? The duties that are not eternal, and only do the Nitya Dharma of Vaishnava Dharma. And of course, for somebody like Devidas, that's almost hellish, because he's so attached to the Naimitika functions of being a Brahman and everything that comes with a certain kind of prestige of being an elevated human being, or like a prestigious human being. And then Devidas says, very well, but I have a doubt in this connection, and that is that the different angas of Vaidhi Bhakti are like significantly connected with matter. So how can you say that that's not Naimitika, or like I can't find the word. Anyway, that's not how is that eternal? Say like deity worship, you use all these material ingredients and everything. How is that Nitya Dharma? And Lahiri says, my dear son, it took me a long time to understand this point, but try to, pay close attention, try to understand what I'm saying here. And he starts off his explanation of how it's possible that there seems to be a connection with matter, although it's supposed to be eternal, by saying that there's two types of people, really. You can categorize people roughly in two different categories. Excuse me. The one category is the people who look for immediate results in their lives, basically just pure karma. Like you look for happiness and satisfaction, and you look for it in your immediate surroundings. And it's this like, like an immediate grasping at whatever brings pleasure, and you avoid the things in the immediate surroundings that bring pain. And then the other type of people are the ones that strive for like a higher attainment in the future. Like they put in the work now to get a higher attainment than just that immediate sense gratification. And then again, there's always all these categories. So then he breaks down the second type of, and let me just mention the terms. The people who look for immediate returns are called aihika. And the ones that look for the higher attainment in the future are called paramartika. And within the paramartika class of people, he breaks them or categorizes them into three different types. There's the Ishanugatas, who are like theists, like they want to worship God. And then there's the Jnananishtas, who are like steady in their pursuit of the impersonal knowledge and personal attainment. And then there's the Siddhikamis, which means that they look for these kind of like mystical perfections or mystical powers. And I thought it was interesting, but Bhaktivinoda mentioned through Lahiri Mahashai's mouth that the materialistic scientists are part of these Siddhikamis. I guess because they sacrifice a lot to get these results that bring dividends in the future. And then Lahiri goes on to explain the different ways these different categories worship Krishna or Vishnu, and in that way seem like Vaishnavas. Like the Siddhikamis, we've talked about this before, but they think that they worship Vishnu, but they see him as just one of the devatas or one of the demigods, and that Vishnu is under the rule of karma. And the Jnanis, they don't even care if God is real or not, if he exists or not. They just use worship of God as a method to clean their chitta. It's like a form of sadhana that clears out their chitta, and so that they can eventually leave behind all forms and merge with the absolute. And then Lahiri says that really the only true form of paramartikas, or people who look for the ultimate attainment, higher attainment in the future, is the Ishanugatas. because there's both in the Gyanishtas and the Siddhikamis, there's like a tinge of material motivation, or in a way that the, like we talked about before, the sadhya and the sadhana, or the practice and the goal, don't correspond. Like the Siddhikamis and the Gyananishtas, they reject their sadhana once they attain their goal. So in that way, their dharma is not nitya, it's not eternal, because the dharma is just the means to get to the final goal. And so in this way, the Ishanugatas, the followers of the Lord, really is the direct translation, are considered to be only the real followers of real Paramartikas. And Devidas, like, his faith keeps growing as these conversations go further, and he recognizes the point, but then he still raises a doubt. He says, like, that the Sri Vigraha, the deity form, is fashioned by a human out of material elements. So how can that form be eternal? And then Lahiri Mahashaya says that, let me just read a direct quote, because it's a really nice explanation. We probably have to break it down a little bit. And I should mention that, I don't know if you guys had the same doubt, but I certainly had this doubt when I was a new devotee. I remember when I was 18 and I got into Krishna consciousness, and I was really attracted to the philosophy part. But then when I went to the temple and there was the deity worship going on, it felt like strange, for sure, for me. And the doubt was specifically the same doubt, like, how is this spiritual? You do all these things. And of course, the assumption is, when you think like that your mind is not material, which it is. Then when you get deeper into the philosophy, you realize that whatever you conceive in your mind is also material. But there's this idea in the West that meditation, the kind of meditation that actually happens on the level of the mind, that's spiritual, and the gross matter, that's just purely material, and there's no bridge between the two. And I remember my ex-girlfriend, she was a Christian, and she was like, how can you do this deity worship? It's so disgusting. Like, she was totally put off by it. And I remember telling her, well, yeah, that part's a little weird, but I really like the other stuff. So that was my misconception at that time. When I became a devotee, I could not make the connection. And so Devidas is voicing this exact same doubt here. And so the direct quote I wanted to say is that, so Lahiri Mahashaya, the way he answers is, first he says that, well, the deity form is not like that. It's not material. Like, Bhagavan is everywhere. He's all, what is the word? Omnipresent. He's everywhere. Yeah, all pervasive is the word. And then he says, Lahiri says, Bhagavan's transcendental form of eternity, bliss, and knowledge is first revealed in the pure consciousness of the jiva, and then it is reflected in the mind. So basically, the Svarup Shakti, the consciousness, you have a spurti, or like a vision of the Lord, and then it reflects on the mind. The eternal form of the deity is fashioned according to this transcendental form revealed in the mind. And by the power of Bhakti Yoga, which is the Svarup Shakti, the Satchidananda form of Bhagavan then manifests in the deity. When the devotee takes darshan of the deity, that deity unites with the transcendental form of Bhagavan that the devotee sees in his heart. And I guess one thing that comes to mind right away is the story about Prahlad and Hiranyakashipu. Because, so Hiranyakashipu, he had tried to like make his son the same kind of nice demon as he was, but Prahlad was not kind of like learning the lesson. And so he'd go to school, and there were these like demon teachers in the school who were trying to like kind of brainwash him into this like demonic materialistic way of looking at life. But he was like a natural devotee, so his heart just wouldn't go there. And so Hiranyakashipu would always ask, like, well, what did you learn today in school? And he would go like, well, I learned that Bhagavan's this and this, all this like glorification of God. And Hiranyakashipu would get like more and more angry about it. And then finally he just had this breakdown, and he's just started like saying, threatened to kill Prahlad, as far as I remember. And then they were in the assembly hall of the palace, because he was a king. And he screamed at Prahlad, like, where is your God? I'm not seeing your God anywhere. Is he in this pillar? And then Prahlad said, yes, actually he is. He's everywhere. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in his commentary to that verse, he says that Prahlad was seeing the Lord right at that moment. And then Hiranyakashipu like rushes off of his throne, and he's a very powerful guy, because he did like something like 10,000 years of yoga austerities by standing on his toes or something crazy like that. And so he's got amazing powers, and he balls up his fists and like smacks into the column, the pillar of one of the pillars in the hall, and it creates this insanely loud voice that even the demigods up all the way up in the heavens are like freaked out by the sound. They think that the cosmic devastation is happening like in too early or something. And sure enough, from that pillar, Hiranyakashipu like roars and busts out, and then the rest is history. But that's all we need to know for this, what I'm talking about right now. And it's just a beautiful example of how Krishna is actually everywhere. He is, as the Paramatma, he's in every single atom. The world, what we think of as matter, is completely permeated by God in every way, because there's only Bhagavan and his Shakti, and that's all there is. So when we think about like, how is it possible that, we worship a deity and that's somehow spiritual, we're really stuck in this like extreme dualistic way of understanding what matter and spirit are. Like, we think they are these completely separate things that have nothing in common. But the thing is that Shakti, this is a really difficult topic. It's very, very complicated and hard to understand, but let me try to do my best at making one point about in relation to this deity worship. And that's that there's really actually only one Shakti. Shakti is being talked about in different ways, in different contexts in the scriptures. And so a lot of times we hear there's the Antaranga Shakti, the Tatastha Shakti, and the Bahiranga Shakti. So basically the internal potency, the marginal potency, and then the external potency. Or Svarup Shakti, Jiva Shakti, and Maya Shakti. But the scripture also says that there's actually only one Shakti, and that like Radharani is the fountainhead of that one Shakti, but then the Shakti behaves differently and takes different forms according to the function that it's performing. So in that way, there's really I guess the best way to look at it is kind of like, okay, and I think Prabhupada has given this example in a different context, is if you think about electricity, that's like the one Shakti, right? But then when you run the electricity to different circumstances, it acts in completely opposite ways. Like you have the AC system, you flip a switch and it cools your house, you flip the switch the other way and it actually warms up your house. But it's the same electricity that just functions in two different ways according to the circumstances. So in the same way, everything is the Shakti of God. It's not that, I guess a lot of times Christians tend to think, I know when you go deeper into Christian theology, it's not necessarily like this, but in general, there's this strong dualism in the Judeo-Christian thought. And so there's this idea that the world is completely separated from God. And then God is somewhere high up, completely separate from the material world. And they have almost nothing to do with each other until a Messiah comes and brings the good tidings or whatever. But the Gaudiya perspective is quite different. And my Guru Maharaj likes to use this term panentheistic, which means that God is completely transcendent and completely immanent in the world at the same time. And to me, that is like such a beautiful idea. It's this perfect achintya beta kind of harmonization of the difference between matter and spirit. So anyway, so in this way, like when you think about the deity, for example, the Svarup Shakti is kind of like the flip of the switch, like in that example of electricity, that when that Svarup Shakti comes through the bhav of the devotee who kind of like imposes his bhav on the deity turns on, so to speak, like like God is in the deity is directly Bhagavan. And I'm not claiming that I understand this, because I'm obviously like, I don't have that kind of level, not even close of realization, but theoretically we can speak about this and try to, the best we can, try to understand how that could be possible. So that's the switch that happens, like the Shakti, the Svarup Shakti starts coming through, or is manifesting in that deity, based on the, like Bhaktivinoda says in what I just read, that the heart of the devotee kind of unites with the image of the Lord, who is actually directly present in the deity. Anyway, that's the best I can do. I hope you got something out of it. And if you have any further realizations or thoughts about that, I would love to hear that in the end of the class. And, you know, I clearly need to think about these things a little more, but that's the best I can do at the moment. And to me, it's a fascinating area of Achinta Bheda, how there's only one Shakti, but it plays out differently in different circumstances. It's, to me, a very clean, beautiful theological idea. Okay, and then, so after giving that explanation about how the deity or how Krishna manifests in the deity, Lahiri Mahashaya makes the point that when a jnani worships the Sri Vigraha, their idea is that the material object, whatever is included in the worship, they turn into Brahman momentarily during the worship. And then when you stop the worship, then Brahman disappears, and then it's again a material item. And Lahiri Mahashaya makes the point that if you have that kind of vision, then it really is just a material object. That's not really Nitya Seva or eternal service, because your view of it is so limited. And so this basically this chapter was all about how Vaidhi Bhakti is eternal. And this is basically what Lahiri is saying, that if you practice Sudha Bhakti, because there's no difference really between your practice and your goal, then that Sudha Bhakti, Vaidhi Bhakti, is eternal, although it looks like you're using material elements and all this temporary stuff to worship God. So it really comes down to Vaidhi Bhakti is eternal only when it's Sudha Bhakti in the context of Vaidhi Bhakti. Vaidhi Bhakti in the context of Sudha Bhakti, because otherwise you're just using material objects to kind of jump ahead and reach this undifferentiated state of Brahman. So at this point, Devidas is actually quite convinced by these arguments. And he recognizes that actually the Jnani's attempt to worship the Sri Vigraha is just trying to cheat Bhagavan, basically trying to cheat liberation out of Bhagavan by acting like you love him, but you want to grab something. Once you get it, you just grab it and run. And then that day draws to a close. Devidas goes back to his place, and then when they come back the next day and they sit down, they're about to start doing their practices and stuff, the Qazi, which is kind of like a governor, the Muslim Qazi, shows up to the assembly. And the Vaishnavas are very respectful towards the Qazi, and the Qazi is very respectful towards the Vaishnavas. And they start conversing about different theological things. And so because Lahiri Mahashaya is very learned and he studied Farsi and Arabic and the Islamic faith, he starts asking these questions to the Qazi. And basically, it turns out that the Qazi is a descendant of Chand Qazi, who Mahaprabhu, I'm sure you all know the story, Mahaprabhu showed all this mercy to Chand Qazi by chastising him about trying to stop the Sankirtan in Navadvip. And so then they start talking about it, and it turns out that this Qazi is basically like an unalloyed devotee or Shuddha Bhakta in the context of the Muslim faith, like all the different ideas of the Gaudiya Sambandha, they have all these same ideas, but he has all these like Arabic terms for the same things, like the Bada Jiva and the Shuddha Jiva and the nature of the ultimate attainment, where you're with God and you don't really worship God, but life itself is worship. So basically there's this whole conversation, and it's like the Qazi has gotten the pure conception from Mahaprabhu, and it's coming out through the framework of Islam, basically. And that's how the 5th chapter ends. But then the 6th chapter, which is called Nitya Dharma, Race and Caste, it starts with the explanation of how disturbed Devidas, the son of Lahiri Mahashaya, was after that, kind of witnessing that exchange. And he'd been a teacher for a good while, and he had this strong faith that the Brahmins are the highest caste and the best people on earth, and that you can't really achieve mukti without first taking birth as a Brahman. And this sounds kind of like wild, I think, to us, because we're used to thinking in terms of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But if you get acquainted with the Hindu ideas, and especially the Dharma Shastra, it's actually a very common idea that you purify yourself gradually and that you can't jump ahead, which we agree, but there's a different, I'll talk about that later. But anyway, so you gradually purify yourself, and then the height of purification is that you take birth as a Brahmana, and then you get the chance to finalize your purification and reach mukti. And so Devidas had been reading, he was a student of Nyaya and Dharma Shastra, and these texts are exactly that's what they're saying. And so he was extremely disturbed by this idea that the Vaishnavas were giving so much respect to the Muslim Qazi, and that they were having this exchange that seemed like they were on equal terms. And I guess it really shows how, like, because it seemed like Devidas started having faith in the Vaishnava Dharma, but because it was very weak, the faith was weak and materialistic, you could say, or like a Kanishta faith. One kind of, what's the word, characteristic of a Kanishta faith or like neophyte faith is that it has to come in the right packaging. And so previously, Devidas had been hearing the Vaishnava Dharma or the Vaishnava Siddhanta from two very experienced and old Brahmanas, like, sophisticated elderly Brahmanas, which was Vaishnav Das Babaji and his father, Lahiri Mahashaya. So he could take it from them. They were able to convince him because it was coming from the right source. But when the same Siddhanta started coming from the mouth of the Qazi, he was completely disgusted by it. And unfortunately, it's a pretty common thing in the Gaudiya Vaishnava world and any kind of religious, I think, society, that we tend to be really attached to the form that the truth comes in. Like a very quick example is just like how a lot of ISKCON devotees back in the day couldn't tolerate the idea that some ISKCON devotees would hear from Srila Sridhar Maharaj, for example, because it was not coming in the right package. It was not the Prabhupada packaging, and it was extremely disturbing to their minds. And so basically that's what Devidas is going through right now. he swears that he'll ignite this blazing fire and burn this heretical view to the ground, And then what he starts doing is he's wondering, like, how can it be that the local brahmanas in that Navadvip area are not like attacking this heretical view? And he's thinking maybe there's some new thing that they haven't heard about yet. So I'm going to go and start talking to them, and we're going to get together and stage an attack. And that's exactly what he does. And a couple of days he applies himself wholeheartedly to the task and gets together with all the most respected brahmanas in the area. And then one morning they show up to Pradumya Kunj, where all the Babajis are. They've just had prasad and they're ready to go on their madhu curry. Excuse me. And the leader of the brahmanas is this guy called Krishna Chudamani. And he's this short guy with the very black, nice luster and these like starry-like eyes, very like a commanding personality. And he steps forward and he says that they would like to, understand why the Vaishnavas associate with Muslims or like with outcasts. And who is the most, out of all you, who's the most skilled debater? We want to debate this matter with you. And Prem Das Babaji, who's the leader of the Babajis, he says very humbly, like, well, who are we? We're just fools. Like, we don't know anything about debating. All we know is that we follow the example of the previous Mahajans, and that's our life and soul. And Chudamani, he's a kind of a proud guy. He says, what is this, nonsense that you say that you follow the example of the previous Mahajans, but you're constantly going against the Shastra and the Hindu society by mixing with castes and mixing with outcasts, especially, like, you're not following the Dharma of being a Hindu. And this really upsets the Babajis because they feel like that Chudamani is attacking the Mahajans, and they get together, they congregate in one of the kutirs and the Babajis, and they say that they have to respond to this charge because the Brahmanas are attacking the Mahajans. And so then they decide that Vaishnav Das is going to be the one debating Krishna Chudamani. And there's this huge assembly. There's like 100 Brahmanas on one side. They set up this like, what would you call it? Debating arena in the Madhavik Kunja. There's this one beautiful Kunja in the overall Pradimna Kunja where they put seats down, and there's 100 Brahmanas on one side and a couple hundred devotees on the other side. And then I'm assuming Krishna Chudamani and Vaishnav Das are facing each other in a center, like a boxing rink or something, intellectual boxing rink or Shastric boxing rink. And Chudamani is making the point that only a person who actually follows the Shastra can be called a Mahajan. And if you just decide to call somebody a Mahajan that you like, and you're materially, or you just somehow think somebody is a cool person, you can't just, pick a person and call him a Mahajan. I mean, this is a very offensive attitude on Chudamani's part. He's basically saying that the Vaishnavas don't understand the Shastra, and they go against the Shastra by not following its injunctions. And you could make the point that Chudamani has a point in a way that you can't just like come up with your own religion and then follow that instead of trying to follow the eternal principles of Dharma. So it seems like he's making a reasonable point. It's like, don't come up with your own stuff. Follow the scriptures that are given to us by, in succession by purified souls. That's eventually, you can trace it back to God. And God is like giving his revelation so that we can follow it and purify ourselves and go back to Godhead, basically. or reach mukti, depending on what your view is. And a couple months ago, I picked up the Manu Samhita because I was interested in like, what is it actually saying? Because there's so much, the more conservative Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they tend to like quote the Manu Samhita and kind of like justify their, what would you call them? Traditional or conservative social views based on the Dharma Shastras, basically. So I was like, well, what is this book actually saying? And if you only read the Manu Samhita, which is one of the main works of the Dharma Shastras, you know, this view that Krishna Chudamani is saying here, it's not at all unreasonable. It's like, wow, I guess that's what the teaching is. But of course, there's much more to it, which we'll get to a little later. And another point to make is that it's like objectively true. And this is, I've heard this from like religious scholars who have nothing to do with Hinduism or Gaudiya Vaishnavism. This one scholar made the point that it's absolutely amazing how stable the Hindu society has stayed for like centuries and centuries. And he was attributing the reason to this, like that strong varnashram system where society is highly stratified to function in this kind of like optimized way, you could say. Everybody has their position based on their natural qualities, and they function in that position, and they have this sense that ultimately the goal of life is mukti. So like all this jostling for position in the world, it's kind of like not so important because there's a higher goal. Whereas if you're completely materialistic, whatever happens in this sphere of existence, the material existence, is the final goal. So you're much more aggressive in trying to get everything you can in this world. And so, you know, you could say, okay, well, Chudamani is making a good point. And what is the, like, why are the Vaishnavas going against this like tried and true systems of having a peaceful society, which in turn enables people, because it's peaceful and stable, it enables them to progressively move towards mukti, which is the ultimate goal on the basic Hindu level. We, of course, have a different view, but anyway, that's the basic Hindu understanding. And in our time, like I mentioned, this definitely plays out in the Gaudiya scene as well. There's kind of like two different schools. There's the conservative school and then the more liberal school. And just recently, there was a debate on the Namra's podcast about Vaishnavi Diksha gurus. And there were two ISKCON members on both sides of the aisle. And the gentleman on the conservative side, who has spent many decades in India, his point was very much similar to what Chudamani is saying, basically that you can't just make up your own shastra. You have to base your arguments on the scriptures. And then he kept quoting this one verse from that's quoted in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that says, Shruti Smriti Puranadi Pancharatra Vidhim Vina Aikantiki Harer Bhaktir Utpatayatva Kalpate. And basically saying, if you worship the Lord, if your worship of the Lord is not based on the Shrutis and the Smritis and the Upanishads and the Puranas and Pancharatras, it's just a disturbance to society. And so this devotee was basically trying to say that if you are for Vaishnavi Diksha gurus, that means that you're not following the Shastra, because there's all these Dharma Shastra statements about, you know, women's position and stuff, whatever. And he was saying that, you know, this verse says that, you know, Dharma Shastra is part of the Smriti, so you have to follow the Dharma Shastra. And so it sounds like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wonder, you know, does he have a point or something? But then you go to the commentary of that section in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and the whole, it's the second, if you want to read it, it's the Eastern division or Eastern wave, the second chapter, where that verse is quoted. And the whole chapter is about how you have to reject Varnashram in the end. A big part of that, that chapter is about rejecting Varnashram if it gets in the way of your bhakti. So that ISKCON devotee, who was the conservative devotee, it seemed like he was making a good point, but then you go to the source, and Jiva Goswami specifically says that this verse is referring to the Bhakti Shastras. And we know, like Srimad Bhagavatam, later on, Vaishnav Das is going to quote all these verses about how even the dog eater, the outcast, is better than the best Brahman if they are devotee and the Brahman is not. If they chant Harinam, they are the best of the best. And so it's really, to me, it's very unfortunate and sad that devotees are trying to justify this like karma mishra bhakti, which means their understanding of bhakti is mixed up with karmic, or in this context, the dharma ideas of what's appropriate and how people should behave, because devotion completely overrides karma. And if you don't understand that, then you start mixing jnana and karma into bhakti. Like, it's so important to understand theoretically how bhakti is completely independent of karma and jnana. And of course, we can't fake like that we're on the complete Shuddha bhakti level. So we might have to incorporate some of it, and we'll talk about that later as well. But we have to understand that, and that devotee was making the point that basically I think he was saying that bhakti has to be according to all the shastras, which include Dharma shastras, and that's just not the teaching. If you read the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and all the Goswami Granthas, it's very, very clear that is not the teaching. Bhakti is completely independent, and we should never try to force bhakti under the lower shastras. And for Western devotees, this is, it's exciting to hear this. At least for me, it's like, yes, like we're not some like Taliban version of Hindus, this like oppressive, rules. And it's just so extremely like preoccupied with all these externals and rules and stuff. But the thing is, from the traditional Hindu point of view, Gaudiya Vaishnavism is an extremely radical movement. So we, at the same time, kind of have to empathize with Krishna Chudamani and Devi Das in a way that they come from a certain background where these religious ideas are like strongly instilled in their chitta. That's part of who they are. And it's very hard to let go of such like core ideas of how you understand religion and the world and your faith and everything like that. And again, it comes down to what Lahiri said earlier, that everybody acts according to their adhikar. But when the Dharma Shastra followers try to impose the lower dharmic understanding on Krishna consciousness, that's when the devotees have to push back sometimes. And that, I feel like, should be pushed back at this idea that Vaishnavis can't be Diksha gurus. It's just another form of imposing karmic ideas on Shuddha Bhakti. And I think I want to stop there for now. We're 50 minutes in, and I think it feels like a natural place to stop. And I was rambling a little bit today, but I had a lot of thoughts on my mind, but I couldn't quite like capture them as I wanted, but I hope you guys got something out of it. And let's see if you guys have any comments or questions. I would love to hear from you.
Haribol, Gurunistha ji.
Haribol, Omkar. How's it
Thank you
going?
for the best. You're really good. I'm sorry I can't catch much while I'm cooking, but
No worries.
what I did catch was you asked about comments perhaps on the Shakti being one,
Yeah.
And I discussed yesterday with Sham Sundar or 2 days ago about kind of how there's Maya, Mahamaya, and then there's Yoga Maya.
Yeah.
And those are both sort of termed as illusion. But then the pure consciousness being in one way only able to be termed as Brahman. So those two forms of Shakti, which are in a sense illusion, are just transformation of the same Shakti, but
Yeah.
forming a different type of illusion. That was really interesting, and I'm still trying to sort of wrap my head around that. And I like that you emphasize that. And that's a really nice thing to think about a lot. That there's just really only one energy.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course the illusion of Yogamaya is like more real than Brahman. So you can think of it as illusion. I guess from the Tattvic point of view, in some ways you could say like that, but that's also, I think, an interesting point. But yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. But then the interesting question is, which I can't really answer very well, but the interesting question is, if there's only Mahamaya and Yogamaya, what's the Tatastha Shakti made out of? But that actually, my wife Vrindarana is going into this stuff right now. She's about to come out with some really amazing articles about that. This is part of the stuff that she's looking into based on Jiva Goswami's Sandarbhas. So, stay tuned. There's some really, really interesting kind of groundbreaking stuff coming out soon.
Wow, cool. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Jai. Haribo.
Haribo.
Anybody else?
Hare Krishna.
Haribo, Marosh. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for asking. I just want to share little realization from what you're saying about. It's impressive for me how Bhaktivinoda Thakur can put himself in the shoes of these different people, and this showing that all these personalities acts under some combination of material modes or something, so he can exactly put them into some like these arguments are eternal. You can find such guys on the internet and stuff. That's nice.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And I guess also because he's kind of looking at the whole thing from the 30,000 foot view, like the airplane view, because the Bhakti Shastras are kind of like the you could say the culmination, or what's the right word, harmonization of all the other Shastras, because he could look at the world of Shastra from that kind of like bird's view. Then it's easier to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. It's easier to understand where they're coming from when you can look at their adhikar and see the kind of like the gradation or the progression of adhikar. But yeah, I've been thinking about that same thing. It's like Bhaktivinoda makes really good counter arguments on the part of the opposition to bhakti, basically. And so much of the first part of Jaiva Dharma is exactly that. Like he's trying to come at bhakti from all these different angles and try to raise these objections, and then his characters just answer one objection after another. Well, definitely well done. Anything else?
Not for me, thanks.
Okay, I guess that's for today. And then next time I didn't really get to the actual debate between Chudamani and Vaishnav Das, but we'll get into the part where they talk about race and caste and culture and how that relates to the kind of like the level of adhikar and all this stuff. And we'll see how the Vaishnav conception of adhikar is this paramarthik idea, or this otherworldly idea of eligibility, and how it goes beyond this material idea of how eligibility and spiritual progress really works. And especially you could say the place of mercy is extremely important in bhakti. Kind of like upends the whole gradual process in so many ways. Anyway, I think I've talked enough. Thanks everybody so much for coming, and let's connect again next week, hopefully. Gaur Premanande. Hari, Hari, Hari.